Hello and welcome back to Storytime with Alex, reading Book 2, From Albion to Britannia, The Last Witch of Old Allbyon by Brandy Pearson. We're on chapter 5. In the last chapter, Miles and Ruth met the Last Witch of Old Allbyon, Rose Cooper, in her magical cottage. And now they're back there and she's about to tell them a very important story. So sit back, relax, and let's listen to chapter 5, Rose Cooper's story, The Black Cauldron. In the days of Old Albion, when wizards read books and witches were wise, times began to change, as they will. Some of the wizards came down from their towers, and many witches were now settled in cottages. The printing press was invented, and it was easier for ideas to spread, both good ideas and bad ideas. Ships and roads improved, and it became easier to travel across the seas, and new and old knowledge spread across the land, some of it great wisdom, and some of it deadly poison. There lived in those times a witch called Rose Cooper, that's me. She lived in a cottage shaded by a great oak tree on the edge of a small wood. She had wandered across Albion in her youth in the manner of her foremothers, but had been offered a cottage by the abbot of the monastery which owned the land hereabouts, to help care for his flock in the parish he had the care of. The cottage was near the old road that led to one of the bridges across the river. She always had enough visitors with their various wants and needs to keep herself busy. Little did she know how long she would be living there, so it was fortunate that she was so content. At the heart of the wood was a tall white tower, built for a wizard who called himself Albertus Maximus. His real name was Albert Smith, but he liked to think he was descended from great wizards of ancient times, and Albert Smith was not a fine enough name, so he called himself not just Albert the Great, but Albert the Greatest. Though the greatest what, I would not like to say. He had no interest in the local people, nor the travellers on the road. He often travelled to the city of the White Tower, the city of London as you would call it, which was half a day's walk away, to meet with other wizards. Rose Cooper did not think about him much at the beginning. He was often away from his tower for months at a time, and never came to call. He was learned, by which I mean he read many books, and he was clever, by which I mean he understood and remembered what he read. He went travelling, and returned to Albion with many treasures and much knowledge. He became well known to the other wizards of Albion, and through flattery and the giving of fine gifts, became an important figure in the wizard's school, the Academy of High Magic. He attracted a particular group of wizards around him who called himself the Flames of Albion, and they hated witches. Those were strange times, full of new ideas and old ideas that had become lost and were found again. It was also a time of strange weather. It would rain when harvests needed gathering in, and there would be drought when the crops needed rain to grow. Witches know weather law, but one of the things they know is how dangerous it is to interfere too much with the weather. Good weather in one place can produce disastrous weather somewhere else. People turned to the witches and demanded better weather, but there was little that could be done. While witches and wizards looked down on one another, much of it was light-hearted, and there are many stories of witches and wizards helping one another out. Many of the tales I have written down are such stories. Admittedly, I know more stories of witches helping wizards rather than the other way around, but wizards were never so fond of storytelling. There is a very helpful wizard in this tale, even though it does not end well. Rose Cooper, that's me, had a friend who was a wizard. His name was Sebastian Jones, and he lived in his tower across the river, not far from the bridge which carried the road that ran by her cottage. He was originally a friend of the abbot, and would come and talk theology and the like over a cup of herbal tea in the abbey. On the way back he took to visiting Rose. He would bring her honey from his beehives, and she would make honey cakes, and they would drink her elderflower wine together. It was from Sebastian that she first heard about what Wizard Albertus was getting up to away from his tower in the wood. Sebastian did not trust him, and was very worried about him, quite rightly as it turned out. Time passed, and Albertus got himself elected prior of the wizard's school. The prior was in charge of the whole place, which meant that, on his election, he was ceremoniously given the keys to every room in the school. He had ceremonial duties, welcoming visiting wizards from foreign parts, and having meetings with the mayor and the king and other dignitaries. But Albertus soon announced that his chief task as prior would be to make an inventory, a list of everything that was in the school buildings. It had been the wizard's school for many hundreds of years. It was a big, rambling building with a library the size of a ballroom, and a ballroom too, as well as many attics and basements and cellars and studies and kitchens, most of which were packed with magical artifacts that had been donated to the school or just left there when aged wizards died, over all those hundreds of years. The other wizards at the school thought this was a fine thing to do. They liked nothing better than a good list, and they all joined in with what we would now call clipboards, only fancier, and floating pots of ink and the finest quill pens. However, rumours began to spread that he was looking for something in particular, though for a long time no one knew what it might be. He would carefully read through every list the other wizards showed him, but left putting all the lists together into any kind of inventory to others. The tale that began to spread around was that he had found references to something special in books and stories from far lands, something that seemed to have been finally donated to the wizard school, and then lost in amongst all the magical stuff. But what might it be? For many months he roamed the school, unlocking doors with his huge bunch of keys and getting the other wizards to list what was behind them. Doors were opened that had been locked for 100 years, and wizards would stand by with their wands in case anything unpleasant had been locked in deliberately, or indeed by accident. They would diligently list everything inside and show it to Albertus. As the inventory, or the search, went on, Albertus started to read a huge handwritten book called The Accounts. It did not list money made and spent, but was a kind of diary of what had happened in the school. It included a story that had actually been written down for the school by a witch, a story you both know that I called The Witch and the 12 Days of Christmas. In the story you will remember that the true wizard Casper was found imprisoned behind a magical wall in the school, and Albertus realised that such a wall might have been created to hide what he sought. He tried disclosing spells in every room in the school. It was only when it was much too late that Sebastian and I realised that he finally found what he was looking for. Albertus and his cronies, the so-called Flame of Albion, smuggled what he had found out of the wizard school through the water gate and brought it up the river in a barge to the landing place next to the bridge that was near here. They heaved it and hauled it onto a cart and brought it, with a team of 4 horses, to his tower in the woods. I saw the cart rumbling up the road, carrying something totally covered by a tarred cloth. It disappeared onto the path through the wood that led to his tower. I climbed up the great oak tree that stood in my garden at that time. Alas, all that is left of it now is a stump with a bird bath on top of it. Sitting on a branch far up the tree, I saw them set up a pulley, strengthen it with magic, and haul this thing, still covered up by the cloth, onto the tower roof. I remember the moment they pulled off the cloth and I saw it for the first time. I almost laughed, for it was nothing more than a huge iron pot, a cauldron. Witches often have small cauldrons. There's one over there by the fireplace. We use them to create herbal remedies and other concoctions and cook stews for supper. Wizards prefer strange glass retorts and the like, and get someone else to do the cooking for them. But his was no ordinary witch's cauldron. It was large enough for a man to hide in, should he want to. It was then that I started to get worried. There were many ancient stories about magic cauldrons that belonged to powerful witches. These were cauldrons that could provide as much food of whatever kind that was needed for a gigantic feast, or keep whole villages in food during times of famine. There were stories of cauldrons that could bring people back to life, even if they had been hacked to pieces by their enemies, if you knew the right spells. But as I looked at it, I realised that this was not that kind of cauldron. Even at that distance I began to feel its evil, to smell it on the breeze. I climbed back down the tree, away from the smell. I wrote a message to Sebastian and another to the abbot, and charmed a couple of wood pigeons to deliver them for me. As I waited for replies, I realised that this was what Albertus had been searching for in the wizard school, and my blood ran cold. At which point I will make us another cup of tea and perhaps some toast. Run out of tea, so I can't drink any myself. Anyway. I'd been so engrossed in that story that I'd not noticed Ruth. She was looking bothered. "You okay?" I asked her quietly. This was an extraordinary story in the middle of an extraordinary afternoon. It had begun to grow dark as Rose Cooper had told us her tale, and I realised that we'd been here for a couple of hours. We would have to go home soon, or our parents would start to wonder what kind of a lunch we were having that lasted till well after dark. A story, Ruth replied. I think I may know what's coming next. But she would say no more. The tea was soon made and bread toasted over the fire. We were given 2 slices and told to help ourselves to butter and jam. As we munched, Ruth Cooper, the last witch of Old Allbyon, continued with her story. Wizard Sebastian and the abbot arrived quite soon. They both arrived by horse. They were not as good at tree climbing as I was, but they managed. When they saw the cauldron, they both immediately knew what it was. It was called the Black Cauldron, and it was the shadow, the opposite of the cauldrons in the old tales that I knew. If there was a feast, the cauldron could take all the food and drink away, sucking it into its empty maw. If a living person were foolish enough to get into it, or was thrown into it by those who meant them harm, they would be torn to pieces and die, and then disappear altogether. It swallowed up whatever it was called to swallow by the one who used it, which was why it had been hidden away behind a magical wall in the wizard's school to keep it out of harm's way. The prior at the time when it came to the school was the only one who knew where the cauldron lay, and he never told anyone its location. After he died, it was lost, but wizards are wizards even when they are doing good. The scroll upon which were written the spells needed to awaken the evil magic of the cauldron were kept in the library, because the prior could not bring himself to destroy it. Words and parchment and paper mean so much to them. From time to time a wizard would come across this scroll, and so the memory of the cauldron lingered, and in time Albertus came to find of its existence and begin his evil quest to find it. As soon as he saw it, Sebastian returned to his tower and made spells to gather together a group of his friends, wizards who had no time for the so-called flame of Albion. I sent out messages to all the witches I knew, but it's a great sadness to me that none of them would work together with wizards against this evil. Albertus and the flame had poisoned relationships between the witches and the wizards. Some of them called me names, said I was a turncoat working with wizards at all. None of them would come and help. Luckily, if it was luck, one of Sebastian's friends had once read the scroll in the library and knew that the cauldron could only be used on the 3 days of the new moon in the winter months, dark times of the year, in December, January and February. It was an ancient evil and took no ken of the Christian festivals. The next time that the flame could be used would be on Holy Innocents' Day. When's that? I asked. December 28th, Rose Cooper replied. The day when the church remembers when Herod murdered the babies in Bethlehem, trying to kill the baby Jesus, because the wise men, wizards no doubt, had told Herod about him. Most evil magic cannot thrive in the days around Christmas, but this was ancient magic, performed by people with no faith, careless of the good and the light. The cauldron would have swallowed the light of the whole universe if it could. And so, 7 days before the Feast of Holy Innocents, Sebastian gathered a small group of 7 wizards, and the abbot promised to come with a dozen of his monks. The plan was to gather here on St. Stephen's Day, what is now a day called Boxing Day. The monks would not fight, and came to pray and support the wizards in other ways, but each wizard had a sword and their own staff. The abbot said Mass and blessed us all. I remember some of what happened on Holy Innocents' Day as if it were yesterday. Other things I only found out afterwards, though afterwards is sometimes a really big word. I was sent up the oak tree with a spyglass that one of the wizards gave me. At dawn I saw the flame go into action on the tower top. Albertus and 2 others appeared on the roof. He was holding a scroll and a small wooden box, the words of the spell and powders they must need. I signalled to Sebastian on the ground, and he and his friends set off through the trees. She paused and shook her head. This is a difficult tale to tell. I've never been able to write it down like the others. After so many years, my heart still aches at the thought of it all. I miss Albion. Ruth suddenly said, I think I know what happened next. Can I say? Rose Cooper looked at her in surprise. Really? Well, carry on then. Ruth started. As Albertus read the spell and must have used the powers, a sort of whirlwind started, a magical whirlwind in a blue sky, sucking into the pot all sorts of wonderful colours, as if it was sucking them out of the world. As it grew stronger, it started to roar until the noise was almost deafening. There must have been a fight between the 2 groups of wizards. The wizard who was helping Albertus must have gone to help the others, and left him on his own chanting the spell. Only one of Sebastian's groups reached the roof, and by then he had a piece of cloth wrapped around his head because he'd been hurt." "Indeed," said Rose Cooper. "That was Sebastian himself. He had a sword wound across his head." She was looking so strangely at Ruth. I probably was too. "It's my dream. I've dreamed it since I was small, though I never knew who they were. Sebastian tried to stop Albertus chanting the spell. He attacked him with his sword, but Albertus just dodged away and kept on chanting the words. In the end, Sebastian dropped his sword, grabbed his staff in both hands and swung it at Albertus's head. He hit him on the side of the head, and Albertus fell down and stopped chanting. Then there was a great silence, and the whirlwind started to fade away. Just as it was disappearing altogether, there was a sound like a sigh. That's always when I wake up. It's not the roaring or the silence that wakes me, but that sigh." I remembered Ruth telling Miss P and I about her dream. It was suddenly all even stranger. "How many times have you dreamt this dream?" Rose Cooper asked her. "I don't know, dozens of times, ever since I was quite small." "Well, Ruth Mortimer, there's more to you than black nail varnish and boots," said Rose Cooper. "This is a mystery to delve into when we've more time, but yes, that's what happened. That sigh." She paused and sighed herself before carrying on. "What the whirlwind had been sucking into the black cauldron was all the witches' magic in the land of Albion, including mine. I felt it being dragged out of me as I sat up in the tree, trying to see what was happening. When the chanting of the spell stopped so suddenly, a little of that magic escaped. That was the sigh you heard, though whether that was the magic or me who sighed, I'm no longer sure. When my magic returned, it was as if it had hit me in the face. I overbalanced and fell out of the tree." She grew silent, and for a moment looked as though she might be very old, then sat up very straight and continued. "When I woke up, Albion had gone. Albert Smith the wizard was not the greatest, certainly not the greatest wizard, though perhaps the greatest fool. When Sebastian knocked him out, the spell faltered, but by then the witch's magic it had sucked into itself gave it great power and made it able to start up again of its own accord. What was it hungry for? Life, magic, light? I've never quite understood why it did what it did. All I know is the result. I awoke in my own bed, in my own cottage, in this cottage. Wizard Sebastian Jones and Abbot Joseph were here, but everything else had changed. Drawing out the witch's magic made the fabric of Albion weak. Albertus had not understood that Albion was held together by the witch magic and the wizard magic, and taking one of them away upset the balance of its very fabric. When the black cauldron had started to suck into itself even more than that, the spirit of the land had arisen. It needed to stop the cauldron, and so it caused an explosion. Not an explosion of gunpowder or even of nuclear fission, but an explosion in the fabric of reality. A fire could be seen on top of the tower for miles around, so that in later years a story arose that there had been a beacon there. The black cauldron cracked, and the tower cracked, and the world cracked. The cauldron and the tower and Wizard Albertus fell into the crack, and the crack closed over them. Sebastian has never been sure whether he just leapt off the roof in time, or whether the spirit of the land pushed him to safety. He found himself halfway up an elm tree covered in cuts and bruises. He'd been the only survivor of the fight at the tower. But something else had happened. It was as if the world was a clock that had been broken. The spirit of the land had prevented more damage. Perhaps the black cauldron could have sucked up the whole of reality if it had not been stopped, but it could only restart the clock in another time and another place. In Old Allbyon we had not taken much account of years. We measured our lives by the turning of the seasons. There had been a king in the White Tower, but we did not take much account of him either. Suddenly the three of us, Wizard Sebastian, Abbot Joseph and I, were in a world we did not know. Sebastian and I had magics the world did not understand, and the site of Sebastian's tower was a row of houses where no one knew him. Father Joseph was abbot of a pile of ruins that had been destroyed by order of a King Henry he knew nothing about, and the land given over to strangers. When we left my cottage for the first time, there were families camping under the trees in the wood who had fled the city by the White Tower, London as it is called, some because of a plague that had spread through the city, and others because of a fire that had raged 3 months before. I've always been grateful to those people. I would visit them and help them with herbs and food from my garden. I soon learned not to use my magic, or not let it be known. That year had the number 1666 after the birth of Christ, and every year since has had a number 2. There was a silence. I wasn't sure what to say. It was extraordinary. It explained what we already knew, sort of. Ruth recovered first. Where the crack healed over, is that the doorway, the bridge? Rose Cooper nodded. Ruth continued. You couldn't go back through the doorway, the bridge? Rose Cooper shook her head. Before we realised how dangerous it would be for everyone and everything else, we did try. The spirit of the land had saved us, had brought the 3 of us here, but we can go nowhere else. We cannot travel over the sea, not even to the Isle of Wight. If we try, and we have tried over the years, the other side of the water is this side. When we tried to cross the bridge it was the same. We discovered the power of the cats, and we gathered together 12 of them, and we tried on the right day of the year, but when we crossed the bridge we just arrived back at this side of the bridge. We gave up the attempts about 200 years ago, and we buried the entrance to the place where the thin place occurs. So where are Wizard Sebastian and the abbot now? Ruth asked. The last I heard of the abbot, he was in Edinburgh. He still answers his calling as a priest, but that means he has to move around before people realise that he's 300 years old and ask awkward questions. I've lost contact with Sebastian Jones. Something happened during the Second World War and he stopped visiting me. The abbot would know where he was. Does the abbot come visit? She asked again. From time to time, but I know he's still around. He pays my pension. But that's another story, and one is enough for today. Thanks for telling us, said Ruth. So what do you want us to do now? Keep your eyes open for cats and those who might steal them away. Look after Miss Phillips and call me Rose. Then I know we are friends. Of course we will, Ruth cried and reached over and hugged her. Rose looked alarmed, but then she laughed merrily. Well, thank you. No one has hugged me for about a century. How sad, said Ruth. I'm not a particularly huggy person, but I gulped and hugged her too. It seemed the right thing to do. You mustn't come here too often. People might get suspicious. But until Miss P gets on her feet again, you will be my link to the world. Perhaps we could meet in the big park next time. I like to go out for a walk every day. Could we meet up next Sunday afternoon by the duck pond? I'm sure one of us could, at least, couldn't we? Ruth asked me. I don't usually do much except watch TV on Sunday afternoons, I answered. It would do me good to go out for a walk. How about 2 p.m. by the duck pond? I'll look forward to it. I'll bring some extra food for the ducks. It's getting later in the year and I'll be needing a little bit more. I'll see you then. And we'll also see you by the duck pond next time. Bye.